DAGBERT, written and narrated by Tim Broadbent. Once upon a time in England, in the county of Sussex, there lived a dragon. An enormous and ferocious dragon, which terrorised the surrounding countryside. This, of course, was not unusual. Sussex was well known for its dragons, and at the time of our story, a very, very long time ago, they were everywhere. On the lookout from the top of every hill, hiding in the caves and forests and behind every rock, ready and waiting to pounce on any passing animal or, their absolute favourite meal, a small, lost and lonely boy or girl to roast on their fiery breath and swallow in just a couple of juicy mouthfuls. This particular dragon was called DAGBERT, and he had a huge argument one day with a giant called Biggis over a well-fattened cow that both of them wanted for their Christmas lunch. With his long, sharp claws, his whiplash tail, and the smoke and flame shooting out of his mouth and nostrils, DAGBERT was sure he'd have no trouble defeating Biggis. But the giant picked up one of the big, heavy lumps of quartz, a very hard sort of rock that's often found in the fields of Sussex, and hurled it with all his might, hitting his opponent fair and square on his scaly head and instantly knocking him out. DAGBERT slumped to the ground near the top of a hill called Kingly Vale, and there he lay, in deep, deep hibernation for many years. For centuries, in fact. He lay there for so long that his entire sleeping body became covered and completely hidden by the earth and grass, trees, bushes and shrubs. Hundreds of years later, with DAGBERT still snoring away under the mound of Kingly Vale and totally oblivious to the sheep grazing on the grass over his head, Sussex was invaded by the Vikings. They came from the north in their longboats, which, by coincidence, were known as dracars, due to the dragon's heads sculpted on their prows. Living in a cold and inhospitable climate, way up in the frozen north, well, maybe they just wanted a bit of a holiday further south in the sun. But if this was the case, you could hardly call them ideal visitors. They left chaos and destruction wherever they went, robbing villagers of their crops and cattle, burning their houses, and generally making an absolute nuisance of themselves. They made off with everything. So much, in fact, that they had to set to work on a whole new fleet of boats to carry off their spoils. Their new dracars, of course, were made of wood, and by chance, well, for them at least, a large part of Kingly Vale was covered by a dense forest of oak, elm, beech and yew trees that had grown there undisturbed for more years than anyone could remember. They were therefore big, strong and mature, just what the Vikings needed, and they began cutting them down by the hundreds, by the thousands, sawing them into long planks and hammering and chiselling them into shape to build their fleet. They felled and sawed, hammered and chiselled from early morning until late at night, singing their strange native songs too at the tops of their voices, making such an almighty row that they woke the sleeping DAGBERT. And not surprisingly, being roused by all the unwelcome noise and still suffering a terrible headache, the dragon wasn't happy. In fact, he wasn't just not happy, he was absolutely furious. The Vikings, heavily engrossed in their felling, sawing, hammering, chiselling, and loud and raucous singing, suddenly began to feel the ground start to move beneath their feet, like the beginnings of some terrible earthquake. And they went, "Oh!" and "Ah!" and "Oh!" in their total incomprehension of what was happening. They gazed at each other, shaken and confused, as the entire hillside of Kingly Vale began splitting open, and they stared in complete and utter terror as the huge green head of the angry dragon slowly emerged through the chalky soil. Dagbert rubbed his eyes and rose on his enormous hind legs to tower over the invaders, his scaly feet, armed with razor-sharp claws, scraping at the ground as clouds of thick black smoke billowed from his mouth and nostrils. Looking around, he saw the terrible desolation caused to the countryside. His countryside. And he was determined to make the boat builders pay for their savage destruction of the forest. Not to mention having disturbed his deep sleep with their dreadful cacophony. So what did the Vikings do when they saw this horrific monster rising from the ground before them, breathing its fire and obviously about to rip them all to shreds in an instant? Well, they of course did what you, I, or anyone else would do. They gave up their sawing, hammering, shouting and singing and ran as fast as their legs could carry them, dodging this way and that between the tree stumps, tripping over branches, roots, rocks and abandoned tools, down the hillside towards the sea, with the fiery breath of the dragon on their backs, setting light to their long blonde hair. Those that managed to reach the water's edge plunged into the waves to douse the flames, and they swam as they'd never swum before, like a shoal of terrified mackerel, as far and as fast as they were able to escape from Dagbert's anger. Scrambling aboard the dracars, with the dragon's breath boiling the water around them, they hoisted their sails and headed for the open seas to return north. Never again to set foot in this strange country, where grotesque and ferocious creatures spring unexpectedly from out of the ground. Dagbert watched the invading horde disappear over the horizon with a sense of satisfaction, before scratching the bump on his sore head and grumbling to himself when he remembered the outcome of his battle with Biggis. Worn out by the chase, he turned and began walking slowly back up Kingly Vale, kicking angrily at the fallen trees and shaking his head at the surrounding devastation. His forest, once so vast and dense, had all but disappeared. Its oaks, elms, beeches and yew trees lay scattered across the ground, the soil laid bare by the marauding horde of savages. Given time, though, he thought out loud, nature will heal the wounds. But for this to happen, he knew that Mother Nature must be left in peace. And when he reached the gaping hole in the hillside from which he had risen, he simply laid himself back down on his underground bed, pulled a thick blanket of soil and vegetation over his huge body, and went quietly back to sleep, hoping not to be disturbed until the regrowth of the trees above was complete. And who knows, perhaps Dagbert is still there to this very day, hidden beneath his earth blanket and sleeping peacefully, surrounded by the tangled roots of the forest of once again mature and noble trees above. But if one day you should find yourself strolling through the woods of Kingly Vale, I recommend very strongly that you make as little noise as possible. Do not, whatever you do, spoil the calm of the beautiful Sussex countryside with your shouting and cavorting. Instead, put your ear to the ground and listen. Because, you never know, you may hear the sound of snoring from just below the surface.